All right, welcome to Getting Automated. And today I want to cover the only automation module that you really should ever need when building out automations and how it's drastically underrated and will provide value for your business when you use it correctly. And that is the HTTP module. So in this presentation today, we're going to get into what the HTTP module is, why you should be using it, how you can use it better, kind of the fundamentals around it, as well as a practical demo with both N8N and Make.com. So let's go ahead and jump into it. All right, so as a quick reminder, I just want to talk about who I am and what I do. So I'm Hunter Sneed. I'm the creator of Getting Automated. Getting Automated is a brand dedicated to teaching small and medium-sized businesses how to leverage the power of automation to drive revenue, to streamline operations, so on and so forth. This is a completely free resource that I want to try and put out there to enable businesses to remain competitive with organizations much larger in size through automation. So go ahead and check out the site. Beyond that, I also run a consultancy called Workflowsy that's all around helping organizations actually go and implement this automation to see the results within their business. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. Let me go ahead and flip to the next. Awesome. So in terms of HTTP modules, it's one of the modules within all these platforms, whether it's Zapier, N8N, Make.com, or any of really the low-code, no-code platforms as a whole, that I see that's drastically underused. And the reason I say that is it seems as though people have an affinity to use the native module for that given app or service that they're actually using. And while that's great, what it doesn't do is it doesn't actually provide the flexibility that you often need with services when an API action or something like that isn't actually available to you to use in that given service. And so that is where the HTTP module comes into play. The HTTP module is really what is the kind of root of all of the automation and orchestration that you're doing within all these tools. And what I mean by that is when you have a given action within Make.com or N8N or Zapier, and you're telling it to do a certain thing, whether that's create a contact, whether that's update an order, so on and so forth, really what's happening is that's just an HTTP module that they went ahead and kind of put some branding and parameters around. They as in the platform that you're using, again, Make.com, Zapier, so on and so forth. But they've just made it a little bit easier for you to actually use and interface with that service or application that you're actually using. That said, there's a lot of benefits to not using those native modules based on, again, the capabilities that they provide you or don't provide you, as well as kind of what you can or can't do with the HTTP modules. So we'll go ahead and dive into when to use an HTTP module, how it works, kind of what the considerations are. It can seem definitely a little bit tricky at first when you're first getting started and haven't used that before. It's much more intimidating, admittedly, than using the native module with an application or service. But once you realize the power of what those can do for you, then you'll really kind of understand why you should be using it a lot more often and, again, what it will do for you. So before I even get into how to use it, I want to talk about a couple different things. First thing I want to talk about is, what is an API? An API is an application programming interface. And basically what it is when you are using these automation tools, what you are doing is you are making requests, specifically HTTP requests, to an API. And an API is basically a URL that a company sets up, or really a collection of URLs that a company sets up, and each URL does something a little bit different. And so there may be a URL to get a contact. There may be a URL to update a contact. There may be a URL to make an order or to update an order, or so on and so forth. And so the API really acts as kind of your way to interface with a company or application or service and the data that they have. And so they build out their API, and then they can choose how you actually consume that and what capabilities you give, or what capabilities they give you. And so an API is really kind of a developer's best friend, because it allows you, again, to interface with that application's actual functionality as well as data in a way where you can programmatically do things that will scale and kind of allow you to do things much faster than you would within an actual user interface or web application where you're clicking around, as opposed to being able to use the power of no-code, low-code tools, or even using full-code tools to do different loops and iterations and whatnot that, again, at scale make a huge difference. Really kind of they're the glue or the just holistic interface of any sort of application or service that you interface with. Even when you're clicking around on a website's like actual web interface, you're still making calls to the API. It's just being done through your clicks and your input, and the request is then being translated to an API call that's returning data back. So just to kind of take a step back in terms of what an API is and how you interface with it, we'll get into it in a second, kind of what the difference is between an HTTP request and an API. But I just want to make sure that you understand that the API is really kind of your core communication point of how you interface with an application or service, really anything and everything online, whether that's Facebook, whether that's HubSpot, whether that's Apollo.io, really any of them. Just about every service has an API. And while there's differences between public and private APIs, APIs are really kind of, again, how you're doing that communication. And it's pretty ubiquitous across all of the different applications and tools that are in use today. Okay, so we've talked about HTTP requests and we've talked about APIs, but how do they fit together? And I think that's a great question. So an HTTP request is really all it is a request being made to an API. And so an API has what's called endpoints. And so that endpoint is typically some sort of verb or some sort of kind of noun and verb that comes after like a base URL. And so an example of this is a lot of different sites will have API dot the actual URL and then / and whatever comes after that / is typically going to be your API route. And so with an HTTP request, basically what you do is you specify a link that you want to send a request to. And sometimes you pass in data that you want to go ahead and pass along to the API. Other times they can be completely empty and the API just returns something back. But typically there's some sort of data exchange going on from you, the end user that's sending the API request, and the actual API that's then processing that request, doing some sort of lookup or action on its end, and then again, returning it back to you. So we'll get into the different types of HTTP requests that you should be aware of and kind of when each are used. But just wanted to make clear, HTTP requests are the kind of the actual vehicle to send information to an API, and then the API is the thing that receives the information, goes and does something with it, and returns a response to you. So it's really a request response model. All right, so we're talking kind of back to modules here for a second, because I want to make sure it's really clear, again, why you should care about the HTTP module and as opposed to native ones. And so I've got an example and a demo that will go over this in kind of more detail, but basically a lot of times I find with these different applications that the built-in modules for given services, again, whether it's HubSpot, whether it's Shopify, whether it's Google Maps, really could be anything. A lot of times they do not have full coverage of the API functionality that tool provides with their actual module. And so basically what that means is you're not able to do all the things that the application or service is providing or is allowing you to do. And so typically the way you can see that discrepancy of what's actually available for you to do from the tool and what is available for you to do within your no-code, low-code tool is by looking at the developer documentation and the functionality that's listed there, and then looking at the actions that are available to you in your actual low-code, no-code tool and seeing if there's parity between what you see there and what you actually see within the API documentation. And again, we'll go over that and kind of what that looks like and how to spot the differences. But yeah, we've already covered, this is really just, are these actual native modules within these tools are really just abstractions of kind of the HTTP request. Think of it as a fresh coat of paint on top of the HTTP module to make it a little bit more user-friendly for some of these kind of predefined or canned actions that these tools offer. And then kind of around advantages of direct API access. But There's a lot of them. I mean, it could be dictating the response format that you get the information back in. A lot of times with the modules that are provided to you, again, within Make or N8N or Zapier, they're going to predefine what the response looks like, whereas a lot of times APIs give you different options for what the response looks like, whether it's coming back in JSON, what keys or attributes it's providing back, kind of all sorts of information that could make or break how you're actually building out your automation and the information that you need to be able to build out the automation in the first place. All right. I feel like we've really kind of already covered this. I don't think that any of this will come as a surprise. The flexibility, the future-proofing, all of that, that all makes sense. So why don't we go ahead and skip past this? All right. So one of the things that I want to talk about with using the HTTP module is this concept of authentication and API tokens. You've likely had to provide some sort of API key or something like that with the automation tools that you're using. That typically is something where, again, your automation service, such as your make.com, will provide you a link and say, hey, go to the actual service, go to the developer panel or some sort of settings panel, and go get an API key. That is typically the case as well for any sort of API interface or any sort of API-driven interactions that you're going to be doing through HTTP requests. And so typically the way that all this works is you have to do some sort of authentication. Sometimes that will come in the form of its own separate request, where you have to go and have a node specific or a module specifically dedicated to the HTTP request or HTTP authentication request, where you're getting your token back or some sort of authentication verification back. And then from there, you can make subsequent HTTP calls as well. And that's what's going to actually go and do something with the service. But a lot of times authentication is the very first step in interacting with any sort of API driven process. This can look very different for each service, and each service typically outlines their authentication measures and how they expect you to authenticate with the service through their own developer documentation and API documentation. And so that's something, again, that we'll go over. But just know that if you're ever trying to use the HTTP module and you're getting some sort of forbidden or access denied or anything like that, or unauthenticated error, odds are it's probably because you didn't make any sort of authentication or authorization request. And you need to do that first before you're able to actually go and, again, make those API calls that actually have any sort of sensitive or privileged information that may be specific to you or your account on that application or service. Okay, so with an API, there is a couple kind of core methods that they call them for using an API and doing different actions with an actual API and making those requests. And so the most common one is a GET request. And typically what that is you're telling the API, hey, I want information. And so you're telling it, you're passing in typically some sort of information around what you want. So I want to get a contact type. I want to get an order type. I want to get an invoice type. You want to get some sort of information, and you're telling it what you're looking for. And so with a GET, it's not actually updating any information in the back end of your application or of whatever tool you're using. It's merely answering the request that you're making and providing a response back with that data. Typically, that's going to be in the form of what is a JSON payload. That's going to have kind of all your information in some sort of nested format, so you're able to then easily go and parse and see all the results that it returns. So for instance, if I wanted to see the clients that I had within my QuickBooks, I could make a call to, or an API call via an HTTP request to QuickBooks, and then it's going to go ahead and return me a list of my clients back. Post is completely different. A post method is when you're basically telling the API, hey, I want to go ahead and I want to actually either create something new or update something that exists within the application. And so you're typically providing some sort of ID of what you want to update, as well as any sort of properties that you want to update with that actual item within the application. So again, this could be an invoice, customer information, could be a purchase order, really anything that's in your application that you want to go and update that you could do via a web interface where you go and update some information. You can do the same thing in most cases through a post call to that API for that service. Put and patch is something that you don't see as often. A lot of times post will cover a lot of the functionality that put and patch will do. That said, there are times where a specific tool may specify that you need to use a put or patch method as opposed to a post method for when you're doing something. And then delete is exactly what it sounds like. It is deleting something out of the application or tool that you're using. Could be a custom record, could be a document, really could be anything. And so you'll see that for most of these, your get and your posts are going to be what's most commonly used. And what you'll also notice is a lot of times you'll use get and post in conjunction. So you might need to go and get certain information from your application, such as user IDs or client IDs or invoice IDs, really whatever it may be. So you may have a bunch of different get calls to get all of the necessary inputs that you would need to actually go and make your post call where you're creating or updating something net new. And so you use them in conjunction. A lot of times you're not just really making one API call or one HTTP request, but rather you are making a string of those that is getting the information that you need and then actually going and doing something with it. And we'll show that in the actual demo and how that actually applies. All right. Some of the things that you should know about HTTP requests is that there's a bunch of different components that make up an actual request. And so there are a couple of things to know around actual, or what are called headers. Headers are basically kind of metadata around the actual request. And so it's telling the API endpoint, or just more generally the API, that you're sending the request to certain information about maybe what device that request is being made from. The authentication status, what to accept in terms of content that is allowed or not, all sorts of stuff. But really, it's kind of metadata about the actual request. Typically, with this, you're not actually putting any sort of pertinent data within that. That's specific to like your own data. It's rather information about the request, but not the body or the content of the request. Then from there, there's different types of API accepted formats in terms of the requests that you make. The two big ones are a query format versus body parameters. And so this is going to be dictated by the actual tool or application and service that you're using. So while Shopify may have a requirement for it to be in one format, HubSpot may have a different format that it requires it in. And so this is all going to be outlined in the developer documentation for what it expects as an input. So that way it can go ahead and process your request and go ahead and do something with it. The query and body parameters and really all of this is not unique to a specific type of method. So whether it's get, put, patch, any of those, delete as well, a lot of times you're going to have to still have headers and you're going to have to still specify some sort of query or body that is going to be relevant for the request. And so that's typically consistent, at least the headers are, across any request that you make to a given application or service. Ensuring the actual data integrity as well as the content type. Again, these are things that are going to be outlined within the actual documentation. But more often than not, this is stuff that, as long as you follow the documentation and send the request in the format that it expects, and when I say it, the actual API of the service you're using, then you shouldn't really have any issues there. And then with any of these APIs, basically the way that this whole thing works is when you make a request, you're going to get a response back. And that response is going to come with a response code. It's really an HTTP status code. And so there's different response codes or status codes based on if your request went through successfully. And so typically anything with a 200 status code is good news. That means that your request was processed and it returned a good response back. Anything with a 400, which is going to be probably the next most likely error that you'll see or next most likely response that you'll see, means that, hey, something went wrong. And that could be that you're making a request to a URL that doesn't actually exist. That could be that you're unauthorized. That could be that you sent some sort of key value pair that isn't expected in the response or in the request, and it doesn't know how to process it. But really, it could be anything and everything or really anything that went wrong with it could be a reason why you're seeing that status code. Now, parsing responses. There are a couple of different formats that your responses can come back in. That said, for just about any modern day application, it's almost always going to be JSON. For anyone that's not familiar, JSON is a key value pair data structure with all sorts of nesting that's allowed. So you can have parent and children items and multiple levels of that. But it's typically going to pass information back in a JSON format that's easy to then go and parse within your tool of choice. Again, your bank.com, your Python, whatever it may be. So you can get that information and then go and do something with it. The parsing capabilities is something that's built into just about all these tools, so I wouldn't worry about it. But just know that is the format that you're typically getting your response back in, and that's going to have its own key value pairs for the actual status code, as well as, again, any of the contents that exists within that data. Okay, so we're going to we're going to go ahead and get into the practical demonstration in just a second. And I'll talk about kind of how this specific demo is relevant to a business, and why it's something that is beneficial to my own business, Workflowsy, and how I actually go about prospecting and new business development, how I built out that, kind of where HTTP modules fit in versus native modules in this flow, and then some of the benefits of using the HTTP modules in this actual flow. So let me go ahead and flip over. What I'll go ahead and I'll do is I'll set chapters for both the N8N version as well as the make.com version. And what you can do is, if you're interested in seeing one or the other, feel free to skip around, but I'll go ahead and I'll start with N8N. So let me go ahead and switch screens right now, and we'll go ahead and jump into it. All right. So the flow that I'm looking to do here, and let me zoom in. The flow that I'm looking to do here is with a tool that I really like called Apollo.io. For those that are unfamiliar, Apollo.io is essentially a sales prospecting and outreach tool. And so what it does is it gives you the option to actually go and search for people that are in a kind of target market of yours and obtain their contact information to be able to run outreach campaigns against them. So let me go ahead and flip over and show you kind of what that looks like. So in here, I've got all sorts of different kind of options around what are the what's the management level, where they are located, number of employees, all sorts of information that's really pertinent for me to be able to target down into a subset of the market that I think is applicable and could be beneficial for my customers and kind of working with them. So you get a list of these actual customers or prospects, and then from there, you're able to then go and slot them into what are called sequences. I've got a test sequence here that we'll be using today. And basically what you can do is you can add different emails, you can add phone calls, LinkedIn requests, all sorts of stuff. And so it's, again, a really great way to automate that and do it at scale, that as opposed to having to manually reach out to all these individuals when really a lot of this is just kind of a numbers game. So what I'll show you is in this sequence right now, I don't have any contacts in it. Typically the way this works is you have to align contacts to a sequence, and then it will go and in any of these, it will tailor it if there's certain parameters in there. So for instance, it's passing in the person's name. You can see that it passed in my name down here. But what's kind of tedious about this is Apollo doesn't currently allow you, at least through their web interface, to be able to continually add more people to a sequence. And so while I may add people to a sequence at first, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 100, maybe it's 1,000 people to a sequence, once it goes through and runs that sequence for those list of people, I don't have any more people in it. And that's something that I want to continually have prospecting going on for my business with net new people that are being added to it. And so I wanted to show you how I've solved for that with N8N and kind of where that actually comes into play and why it's beneficial. So what I have here is I've got a number of HTTP specific modules in this workflow. And let me show you something real quick. I don't even think Apollo. No, so Apollo is not even supported within N8N. It is supported within Make, but for this, we'll show you exactly why you'd use an HTTP module, because you don't even have the option to use a native module within this. And I will say Node for this, because I know N8N is node-based as opposed to module-based, but really they're kind of the same difference. So what I have here is I've got a workflow where I basically do a couple things. I talked about get commands, and get commands, how you might need to go and get certain information first, and before you can actually go and do something with it to make a post call or make some sort of call that performs an action rather than just return to information back. And so there's a couple things that I need for this all to work. I need to get what's called the sequence ID. So that's what I'm adding people into, really kind of the campaign. And then what I also need to do is I need to go ahead and get my email address that's going to be sending out the, what it's going to be sending the campaign out from. So in this case, it would be hunter@workflowzy.com. And then I need to go ahead and get a list of people that I think would be a good fit and actually add those to my sequence. And so I can show you kind of what this looks like in terms of the Apollo API and some of the functionality. So there's a lot of information in this actual Apollo documentation that talks about how to go ahead and do authentication. And so in here, we'll talk about how to actually use the API and authenticate it. In their case, they use API keys. Again, there's different ways to authenticate, but API keys is a pretty common way to do it. And so they're using API keys. And then in each of these, I've got options for different functionality within the API that I can do and different API endpoints. And so as I was talking about, a very common format, you just go ahead and zoom in. A very common format with this is they'll do API, then they'll have their domain, and then a lot of times there will be like an API version. That's a path. So like V1 for this case, and then they'll have mixed people as one of their endpoint paths, and then search. And so this is the URL that I'm actually running a post HTTP request against to get information. And then these query parameters here outline what information it expects to receive in. And that's going to dictate, again, the result that it gives me back. And so it'll say this is query parameters is really just input. And a lot of times only some of these are required. And so you'll see a lot of these are denoted as optional. And then you have the ability to add additional optional parameters that are outlined in a documentation document to get to kind of narrow your request in and get a more targeted response back. And so this interface here is pretty common for developer documentation, and it shows you again what it looks like in terms of the request and what it looks like in terms of the response. One thing that is a little bit confusing is a lot of times they'll show you in this kind of shell interface for how you'd make this response or make this request. This is assuming that you would go and make this request from opening up either a command line or terminal within your computer and pasting this in with the relevant kind of properties that you would expect. And so you'd have to pass in your API key, and then say you wanted to go ahead and get more than 10 people in a page, or you wanted to search for people that reside within Chicago or New York or whatever it may be, you would pass in different information here to really kind of hone in on your preferences. So what I've done within N8N is I've done a couple of things. I've gotten my sequence ID. That's a whole different API call around sequences. And so you can say search for sequences, and I've got that here. And this is, again, a different API endpoint. Before it was mixed_people. Now it's email_campaigns/search. So these are different API endpoints, and I'll go through that in just a second, but showing that you're making different requests with different parameters as input, and you're going to get different responses back. And so that's something to kind of consider with all of this. So let's go ahead and flip back to N8N. For this workflow, I'm doing just a kind of test workflow with a manual trigger, just to show you real time what it looks like. But this is something that you could absolutely schedule where it's running every day or on some sort of kind of triggered events. But for this, we're just going to go ahead and click on the test workflow when appropriate. So with N8N, I'm running the self-hosted version, so I wanted to store my API key. I'll go ahead and I'll invalidate it after this, so that way there's no risk of key exposure. But essentially what's in here is I'm just setting the Apollo API key and the actual value. Typically, I don't recommend doing this. This is not the most secure way to handle your API key. Typically, you want to go ahead and store it in some sort of kind of sensitive key storage solution. A lot of these different tools, including N8N, just not on the hosted version, have kind of environment variables or secret variables or something like that you can store stuff in. Still not my favorite way to do it. I typically like to try and use some sort of privileged access management tool, something like an AWS Secrets Manager to store my secrets. That said, for this, we'll go ahead and we'll just store it in a variable just to make it easy as we're passing it in. And so going through this, you'll see the different methods. So again, you've got all these different options here. It'll dictate what method you need to use for what request. And so that's something that is going to be outlined in this. And then it's also going to have a URL that you pass in. And so if you recall the sequence search, if we went back here and said search for sequence, you can see that we're passing in this URL in our actual N8N HTTP request. And so in here, we've got all sorts of options. Again, just follow the documentation for whatever service you're using. That's going to be the easiest way to do it. But in here, it's really asking for me to send a couple things. So if we flip back to this, we can see in here that it's sending the API key, and it's also sending the actual sequence name. And so if we look back into N8N, you can see here that we've got that in there where we're passing in the API key and we're passing in the sequence name. And so then on the right side, you get your output. And this output, this view is not really representative of what actually comes back. This JSON view is probably a better idea of what it looks like. And this may look somewhat intimidating, but really this is pretty easy to actually go and extract whatever information you want to out of. And it talks about kind of what is the actual stuff that I searched for. So again, it's searching for test HTTP sequence, which if we go back to Apollo, we can see that my sequence name is in fact test HTTP sequence. And then within this, it's got all of the kind of relevant metadata and information that is relevant to this response. And you can see that it did find that actual campaign, and it found the ID of it as well as the name and any other information that I need from that. So we've got that. I mentioned we have to get an email account that we're actually sending this out from. So there's a different call. This call is a GET call. So you'll notice here I'm not sending a body. For GET calls, it's pretty common to not send a body. And I'm just trying to go ahead and to get the actual user ID as well as the ID of the mailbox for Apollo. And so by making this call, again, a different path. What I'm doing is I'm getting the output back that I can go ahead and use in later steps to validate that, that I can use in later steps that is required as an input parameter for the steps that I have going forward. So I've got my sequence ID, I've got my email account ID, and now what I need to do is I need to go and search for people. And as I was showing you in the interface here with the search, you can make it as granular or as broad as you want to. The search that I'm doing for this demo is actually pretty straightforward. I'm really just searching a couple things. I'm searching for people that have an organization ID of apple.com. So anyone that's got an @apple.com email address is going to be within my target. Then I'm only searching for 5 people, and I'm also searching where they're actually located. And so this is all information that's associated with each contact within apollo.io, and it's going to go ahead and return me a result or 5 results if there is any. In this case, there will be. And then I'll go ahead and take the results and I'll actually go and add them to the sequence. And so with this, let me go ahead and we will look at the results. And as you can see here, I've got a couple results here that are returned. And so I've got someone by the name of John Lewis. Looks like he's a sales manager at Apple. If we keep scrolling down, I've got another one, another contact here as well. And I can go and I can see that there's really a couple of these that have been returned, or a couple of these folks that have been returned that I can go and add to my sequence accordingly. And so what I want to do is I want to go and get all of those individual people that were returned, and I can show you kind of what that looks like just in a cleaner format. Let me go ahead and minimize the breadcrumbs. As you can see, the nesting here, what I've got is I've got a group of people that were returned. Computers typically count from 0, and so that's why it's 0 through 4, but there is still 5 results. And so I've got an individual result for every single person on here. And so again, the John Lewis, and the next employee as well, and all the way through to this 4th person. And so I want to go ahead and iterate over each of those people, because that's really what I care about, is the actual individual within the result that I want to go ahead and add to the actual campaign. So if I flip over to this with the create contact, or actually let me flip to the iterate over, you can see that I'm going ahead and I'm filtering on the people field, which is right here. I can go ahead and drag it in. It's really not, I just need one of it. And then the response that it gives me, if I minimize the breadcrumbs in some of these, is that I get just one person for each item within N8N. And an item is similar to what you would refer to as a bundle within Make. But that item gives me all the information about that person that I need to then go and actually add them to the sequence. So now within Apollo, they differentiate between a lead, and basically you have leads in Apollo and you have contacts, and the way it works is you only have access to so many different contact information retrievals each month. And so anyone that you see within Apollo, you can see kind of their high level information, but if you want to actually get their email, that takes a credit. And so you have to convert them from a lead to an actual contact. And that's when you go ahead and you get their contact information. Typically it's in the form of an email address that you can go and use to go ahead and add them to a campaign. So in here, what I'm doing is I'm doing another HTTP request. Again, you'll see that I'm using a different URL with a different body. And that's going to dictate, again, kind of what I'm looking to actually go ahead and get. And so again, I'm trying to convert this person from a lead to a contact. And then last but not least, I'm actually adding them to a sequence within Apollo. And so if we went back in here, let me pull it up and we go to contacts, you can see there's no contacts in this sequence. And that's because I haven't run the workflow yet within N8N. But once I run it, you'll see that there should be 5 people here that were added to it. And if I had this sequence on, I would go ahead and start sending out emails to them, multiple different emails over the course of a couple different days, to actually go and target them as a potential prospect or customer. So let me go back to N8N. Great. And let's go ahead and if we look here, you can see we've got different inputs, and this is where we're really connecting the dots. So we're passing an API key, we're passing in a contact ID, which is specific to each individual contact within Apollo. We're passing in the email campaign, which is really just the sequence that we're looking to try and add them to. We're passing in what account we're sending it from. And then we're passing in what user ID within Apollo, which is my own, that this should be sent from. And so, and also assigned to. And so typically you own different accounts or different contacts within Apollo that are kind of your sales territory or your domain to work with. So now if I go ahead and I save this and I test the workflow, I will show you what this looks like. And you can see we went from one item here, and then we went and did the split out, and now we have 5 items, 1 for each person that was returned in the initial search. And so if we look here, we've added 5 people to it. We can see the responses for the actual addition of each of the contacts to that campaign. So let's go ahead and flip over to Apollo, and I'll go ahead and I'll do a refresh, and you will see that I've now got 5 people in here. And so I successfully added them all through using the API. rather than having to click within the application to go and actually add those people. So that's kind of the high level of how you go ahead and do an end-to-end. I'm going to go and repeat the same process within Make and show some slight differences just even between the platform and how it all works. And then we'll go ahead and we'll flip back to the presentation and talk about why this matters and what you should know going forward and how to use this in other contexts. All right. So we've got a workflow within Make. And as I said, I just explained with an N8N. And I'll go ahead and explain it again within Make and kind of what this means and how to actually interpret it. It's a little bit more friendly within Make, in my opinion, in terms of just the overall user interface and how they allow you to structure requests. And one thing I want to call out here as well is that Make is different in the aspect of you have an Apollo.io actual capability here. And so you've got options to do certain things within Apollo. That said, the options are somewhat limited. And so it still isn't really a perfect fit for us. And so that's why we want to use HTTP modules, or we could potentially also use a Make an API call module. But a lot of times if I'm going to do that, I'd rather just use the HTTP module. I have a lot more flexibility than I would with the Make API call. So what I've got here is the same list of steps where there's some information that I need to do or need to get through actual GET requests. Again, GET HTTP requests to then go ahead and actually create contacts and add them to Apollo. And so just to flip back to the documentation again real quick, we're doing a couple different things. We have talked about authentication and how with this, Apollo is looking for an API key to authenticate with. And so we're going to go ahead and pass that into our requests. And then we're also doing using a couple different endpoints. So we're using the sequences endpoint where we're going and actually seeing information about what sequences are really just email campaigns there are within our account and making sure that we can search for the right one. We're also doing things with doing a people search. So passing information or passing in parameters around the different people that we want to search through the query parameters that we define. And I'm actually going to search for a different company in this one. I'm going to search for NVIDIA instead of Apple. So we have different results that are returned back. And we're taking all these different GET requests and we're doing a POST request to actually then go ahead and add them to a given sequence. So let's go ahead and flip back to Apollo and we'll talk through some of this here. So we've got a sequence ID, and that sequence ID is where we're actually going and we are searching for email campaigns. And so we're passing in our API key. I'm passing it as a variable here. And then we're also passing in our sequence name. And so if we just run this individually, what you'll see here is we've got the results, and it was actually able to find that campaign. If we see it, we see that we found the test HTTP sequence along with the ID that we actually need to go and do that. Then we'll do the same thing with the email account. Again, note that this is a different path and different URL that we're sending a request to. Still both GET commands, or sorry, actually this one was a POST. Still both HTTP requests, but this one's a POST, this one's a GET. You'll see that there's no request content in this. So this has got an empty body, which is more common with GETs than it would be with POSTs. And so let's go ahead and run this one. We run it, and you can see if we expand the data, again, this is in a JSON response. What you have here is you have the actual response back from those different accounts, or from that actual request that you made. And so you've got stuff like the email address, the ID, the user ID, kind of all the stuff that I need to then go and actually pass in to create a contact as well as add contacts to a sequence in Apollo. So let's go ahead and let's take a look. Similar setup here. Instead, we're searching for NVIDIA. And again, we're using a different API endpoint, and we are using a POST request as well. So we'll go ahead and run this, make sure that we can find some people that are a fit. If we go to data here, and we go to people, as you can see, we've got some different folks that were returned as opposed to what we saw within the N8N one that was, again, specifically targeted at Apple instead of NVIDIA. Now, this is the fundamental difference between how Make.com works and how N8N works. Here we're doing kind of what is similar to a for loop, where we are passing in what we want to iterate over. And so in this case, it's iterating over all of the people items within that response, where we can get information about just a single person and add them as a contact and then add them to a sequence within Apollo. Whereas N8N was doing something similar in terms of you were still getting an individual result for each person, but instead of iterating over again or for loop, what N8N was doing was it was splitting out and creating kind of an individual object or bundle, whatever you really want to call it, for each individual person. Same outcome, kind of different ways of looking at it, at least from a platform and how you actually go about that. So we're iterating over the people. Basically what that looks like is, if you see here, we've got the people array. And so if we go into here, we can pull this right on over and you can see that it's the same as it was before. And then what we're doing is we're also creating the contact within Apollo. Again, this is a post request and it's using a different URL. And we're passing in the information about that person. So their first name, their last name, their title, and their organization name. And then last but not least, we are adding them to an actual sequence within Apollo. And so again, we saw Apple people there before. We're going to see NVIDIA in a second. Let me go ahead and save this and run it. So we run it, great. You can see that it did it 5 times, 1 time for each person. That's fine. And then what you can see here is you can see we got a 200 response code or status code. That's good. That typically means it worked. And then it passes back some data saying that it was added, saying that it added that person to the actual campaign. And so if we go and we flip back over to Apollo and we refresh one more time, what you see here is now you have 10 people. And you can see that it's a mix of both NVIDIA folks and Apple folks, all with that same title, because that was what I was searching for. Or I guess similar to that title, because that's what I was searching for within Apollo, and it returned specifically those results. So the overall impact is that you can really get kind of pretty niche about what you're searching for within this, and always have new people added to your prospecting list that you're doing cold email campaign reach outs to ensure that you have kind of new potential leads or prospects always around the clock at any given time, and that you're maximizing your outreach without having to maximize the time that you spend actually doing that. So let's go ahead and let's flip back. We've walked through both of these. I will go ahead and make both of these available within the description. If you want to download either of these, take a look. And I'm also going to swap out the Apollo API key, so don't get any ideas about trying to use that for yourself. All right, so we just went over the actual demo of how to use an HTTP module and why it makes sense. You saw firsthand at N8N where that integration didn't even exist. So you didn't even have the option to not use an HTTP request, whereas in Apollo, you did see that there was a native module for it, but it offered pretty limited functionality and just really wasn't what we were going for. So we went ahead and we built it out. Now we kind of want to get to some of the stuff around what are the things you need to consider and ultimately why you should care. With this, whenever you're making these requests, you should always be making them over HTTPS. That said, that's pretty much a given. I don't know if there's many companies out there that offer just unencrypted HTTP API endpoints. Just about every modern service is going to use HTTPS for their actual requests. And so again, that really shouldn't be an issue. With this, you are going to likely be dealing with some sort of like PII or identifiable data. And so you want to be sensitive about what you're making API calls to and where you're storing that data and how you're interfacing with it. Again, depending on what's being stored within those end systems. So if you were working with a system that say had social security numbers or something that was particularly sensitive, you'd want to be more sensitive about what tools you provide an API key to that actual service and how you interface with them. And then API key management, we talked about that as well. You really want to be careful about where you store those API keys. You never want to go ahead and have them in any sort of public place where someone else could find it and then go and use it for their own kind of mispurpose or abuse. API keys are really kind of the easiest way to gain access to a system that's not your own, especially if someone leaks it online. And so you really want to be cognizant that with those API keys that you are safeguarding them. And also in a lot of cases, services will provide you the capability to limit what that API key can do down to certain actions within that service. Stripe is a really great example of that. And so you can go ahead and have kind of less permissive API keys that are only going to do what you need it to do. And you can have multiple API keys for certain automations or jobs that you're looking to do that all are kind of built to purpose for that specific task, not an API key that has complete access to all your accounts and all your information within that account. That's going to be more on a service by service basis, but something to keep an eye on and kind of consider nonetheless. All right. So one of the biggest headaches with using HTTP requests and the HTTP module is that it's not always clear what's wrong with the requests that you're making. More often than not, it's something to do with not actually following the instructions that are outlined within the documentation. That said, the documentation isn't always great for these different tools and services. And so it can take a little bit of trial and error to actually get something to work properly. And so a lot of times there is going to be some troubleshooting in kind of what that actually looks like and how to best go about trying to fix it. Sometimes that can be in the form of trying different HTTP headers in the actual request. Sometimes that can come in the form of reaching out to support and seeing, hey, this is how I'm making my request. Do you see anything wrong with it? And sometimes it's using third-party tools that help make it a little bit easier to visualize what's actually happening with that. One of the tools that I quite like is called Postman, and Postman is an API client or HTTP request client, more or less, that will go ahead and kind of give you a graphical user interface to see all the different components of the API requests that you're making, as well as the response components from that API to help you kind of troubleshoot a little bit easier and better than what you'd be able to do in a lot of these no-code, low-code tools on their own. And so if I'm ever running into an issue, I'll go ahead and I'll throw it into Postman and I'll try and troubleshoot there. And then once I get an actual request that's working, then I'll go ahead and migrate that over to my automated workflow. So how do you actually get good at these? That's a great question and one that I hear quite a bit. And really what it comes down to is it's just doing a bunch of these HTTP calls. Again, since they are so service dependent and they're different for each service that you're interfacing with, no HTTP call is going to be created equal. And you may see different kind of patterns or different ways to make a GET request on one site that's going to be different on another site. And so the inconsistency can be a pain point in terms of when it comes to getting the hang of how to actually use these. That said, again, the documentation is usually pretty good with these different tools and applications and services. And so if you look at that and at times even reach out to the support team for that application and service, typically they're able to help you out. Testing and collaboration, you can go ahead and have different kind of API schemas and whatnot and HTTP requests and everything else that's saved within a tool like Postman that makes it easier for a team to collaborate on. Not so much of the focus here, but did want to go ahead and put it out there. One other thing to know as well is that APIs are kind of living, breathing pieces of tech. And so an API typically will evolve over time. Companies are typically pretty good about not changing or breaking functionality that existed before. And typically if they are going to do something like that, they're going to go ahead and release a new version. With one of the APIs, we saw a /v1. They may do a /v2 to go ahead and kind of really recreate that API. But more often than not, they're just adding additional response formats, additional inputs or outputs that you can specify that won't actually break your API call, but rather will go ahead and give you more flexibility and kind of the data that it expects you to input and the data that you expect it to output. And with this, I mean, APIs and really kind of this whole area is constantly evolving. There's different types of APIs. The API that I've talked about today is a REST API. That said, there are different types, such as a Graph API. There's pros and cons to each. REST is probably what you're going to come across in most cases. But yeah, there's intricacies with both and sort of really even beyond just those two. And so it's worthwhile to kind of educate yourself on how this all works. And again, when maybe one is better than the other and how that actually implicates or impacts your ability to build out all of these different capabilities. All right, so why should you care? Why does this matter? Kind of why have you sat here through this long to hear all of this. And kind of my key takeaways is a lot of times people run into roadblocks with the low code, no code tools that they're using and think that whatever it is they're trying to build is not actually something they can build because the native action that they need to go ahead and perform isn't available within their tool. Again, your makes of the world. And so with this, a lot of times that action or capability may actually be available, but it just isn't available through the native module. And so you may need to use an HTTP request. And so using those HTTP requests gives you a lot more flexibility and a lot more capability in terms of the actual actions that you're able to do to automate a workflow in your business end to end. In terms of long-term benefits, with all of these platforms, you're kind of really at the mercy of the actual provider, such as, again, your make or your N8N, to not only build out, but also maintain these capabilities within N8 or within their tool. And so something that I see with really fast-moving applications such as like OpenAI or Claude is that they're adding new functionalities to their API all the time and adding new URL endpoints and paths that a lot of times these tools aren't actually incorporating in right away. And so it makes it really difficult to use the latest and greatest functionality if you're not actually using the HTTP module. And so there are some long-term benefits in terms of learning and investing on how to actually use the HTTP module and what that means in terms of what you can build out. And then last but not least, it's really just kind of embracing the HTTP version of automation. It is the bedrock of everything that you're actually doing. It's what's going on under the hood when you're making those kind of native application specific calls within any of the tools that you're using. So to wrap up, thank you so much for following me through this and this kind of HTTP overview of why it could be the only module that you really ever need to use within your automation tools. I always offer people are more than welcome to get in touch with me. There's a couple different ways to do so. You can reach out via email. I'm reachable at hunter@gettingautomated.com, as well as my website, gettingautomated.com. I've also got a link in the description to book time with me. If you have any questions, if you want to work together, anything like that, feel free to reach out. But yeah, this should be kind of more or less of a masterclass on the HTTP module and why it matters and why you should be using it more often, because it really is so powerful and can take your automations to the next level. So thank you so much and great luck automating. Again, reach out if you have any questions. Hope this helped.